This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity, kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, November 19th, 1915, the state of Utah executes labor organizer, songwriter, and member of the Industrial Workers of the World, a.k.a. the IWW, a.k.a. the Wobblies, Joe Hill. Joe Hill was a Swedish immigrant, had been accused of killing a shopkeeper in a botched robbery in Salt Lake City. The trial became a media sensation. Questions about Hill's guilt or innocence flared at a really incredibly tense moment for labor unrest in this country. The night before his punishment, Hill wrote a letter with a phrase that would become a rallying cry for generations: "Don't waste time mourning, organize." But ultimately, November 19th, Hill is marched out to a wall by the Sugar House prison in Salt Lake, a paper heart placed over his chest, and a firing squad took aim and executed him. So, let's talk about the execution of Joe Hill, his legacy as an activist and a songwriter. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So we've arrived at a Joe Hill episode.
It is about time.
Have I told you this? I wrote my undergraduate thesis about Joe Hill.
No,
and so
really?
I've been sitting here waiting patiently,
Very
3 years
patient.
in, and we get emails. I'd say we've gotten a couple emails a year since we started doing the show saying, "Hey, you should do a story about this Joe Hill guy." And I was like, "Oh, trust me." So yeah, I did. And so I will also say, you know how like everyone thinks a story about their dream is interesting, but it's not actually that interesting. And I wonder if the historian equivalent of that is everyone thinks their undergraduate thesis, the story of their undergraduate thesis is interesting, but it's actually not that interesting. But nevertheless, this was the subject.
My undergraduate thesis was on John Brown.
There you go. There you go.
Mine was on Upton Sinclair in the Jungle. It was also incredibly interesting.
Great. And we all went towards rabble rousers, I suppose.
We did.
Right?
And so, yeah, I mean, I did my undergraduate thesis about Joe Hill. You know, Joe Hill has meant a lot to me, both academically and personally. And, you know, I focused in my thing. I actually made a documentary film about him in addition to a thesis.
Oh, wow.
And I focused mostly on his musical legacy because that was kind of the big thing I studied, was sort of folklore and folk music. And I was just really struck by how his songs continue to be played generation after generation. So I talked about kind of his story, but mostly about how, you know, leftist singer-songwriters in the 20s and 60s and then even till today. And I got a chance. It was also an excuse to just like talk to some people like Billy Bragg, who I really admire, and do interviews with a lot of them. And I went out to Utah to film some stuff there and saw the prison.
Really?
And so, yeah, it was really kind of...
That's cool.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing, Kellie, is that you and I can basically take this episode off.
No. Because,
I was like, Jody, take it away.
well, it's funny. I mean, you know, revisiting this, I'm realizing sort of like how spotty some of the details in my mind are. And, you know, I mean, it is interesting. We'll get into this. But obviously, like, the question that pops up when you hear this story, and it's what makes it a little salacious, is like, oh, this activist got executed for murder, and there's that central question of did he do it or did he not? And you know, I think I have my thoughts on that, but my main thought is like it's sort of beside the point. And you know, especially my approach to this story, what I find so meaningful about the story is kind of his legacy and his musical legacy and the myth around him. And you know, the myth at some point doesn't actually care whether he was guilty or not. But anyway, let's lay the groundwork, and you two should definitely carry a lot of the load here. But let's start with who Joe Hill was, and then I think the context of why he mattered so much for the Wobblies and the IWW in that moment. But I mentioned Swedish immigrant, real name not Joe Hill, right?
Right. He was Joseph Hillstrom. At least that was one of the names that he used. His given name, his birth name, is Joel Hagland. He has a kind of, in a way, typical immigrant story, right? Moves to the United States, changes his name, gets involved in certainly a pretty typical story for some immigrants coming to the U.S. in the late 19th, early 20th century, gets involved in labor organizing because so many of these newly arrived immigrants were working under newly harsh conditions in the factories of the United States. And you have a bunch of different labor organizations emerging at this time. The IWW is by far the most inclusive and is one of the more radical ones. So it's constantly being targeted not just by business owners and their private police forces, but by the government as well.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think makes him stand out so much is the partnering of his ideas and the music. So, and maybe we've talked about this before, but like, I don't understand movements without music.
Yeah.
Like, you need a soundtrack, you need a rallying call, you need ways to sort of galvanize and energize people. And I think he understood that really well. And I think that's also what made him a huge target, because people understood that his popularity, his genius that he could bring to sort of, the musical realm was something that could be really contagious, and people that might not necessarily be sort of attracted to something like the IWW now would find themselves in a position where they're listening to something and hearing things that are attractive to them.
So now you're talking my language here, right? And this is stuff I'm fascinated by, is the kind of power of music and the marrying of music and politics. And this is, I think, the first great example in American history of that. One of the things I think about a lot is, well, first off, Joe Hill doesn't necessarily have kind of like a deep musical background. He's not like he showed up and he was a musician, but he has a knack mostly for plain spoken language and language that will cut through. And to your point, Kelly, like, people need rallying cries, and that needs to be simple. But also, we touched on this, but the IWW is an immigrant coalition, and what that really means is that there are tons of different languages being spoken by people coming in, and simple, catchy songs are the way to work your way through that. And so that, at just a sort of tactical level, and I think there's this like romantic, I think, skewed view of like the IWW is like, oh, it was an intellectual flourishing, and like people were sitting around reading progressive tracts and reading poetry and so forth. And it's like, there was a little bit of that. I mean, it was a sort of intellectual movement, but like, a lot of these people were illiterate. They were coming from different backgrounds, and they needed to be bonded together by really, really simple, forceful songs. And a song is easier to memorize than the opening of a philosophical tract or whatever. And so it's just all plays.
Just a little.
Yeah, it all just combines into a really, really powerful force, which is these songs that Joe Hill came to write. He started writing them. The IWW realized they were becoming really popular. They sort of compiled them into this Little Red Songbook, which is this famous thing that then gets passed around, and it gets passed around through the generations. And again, a song is, when you put it out into the world, it belongs to other people right away,
right.
And other people can sing it and own it and adapt it and, make it specific to their particular cause and their fight in that moment. And so I think just as a dissemination and unifying tool for political ideology, it's just incredibly powerful.
And it creates a kind of sense of solidarity. But it wasn't the only kind of thing that Joe Hill was doing. He was deeply involved in labor organizing, labor agitation, in free speech fights. The Wobblies were actually at the center of a lot of these early free speech fights in the 20th century, because one of the big ways the government was trying to shut down unions was trying to shut down organizers and prevent them from saying things that might bring people into their cause, might radicalize them. So he was somebody who, because of these songs and because of his work, is so well known in the movement, right? He's already kind of an icon before he is executed. Is that right, Jody?
Oh yeah, he is. I mean, his name is attached to all these songs, and so the Little Red Songbook is incredibly powerful, and people are singing these songs all over the country. And so, yes, I think they know his name. There's leadership of the IWW who I think are probably the most prominent folks, but I would say after that, he's probably the most well-known Wobbly for sure. And, I mean, Kelly, to your point, he's the one that spooks authorities maybe the most because they see this dynamic.
I think it's a couple things. One, the music, but also like he is sort of flirting around with other ideas and partnering with other people that makes him seem much more revolutionary, I think, than people would initially understand. He sort of flirts with the idea of like joining the Mexican revolutionaries in Baja California, and he has these sort of like big ideas. He doesn't follow through with that, but like the fact that he's thinking about these bigger, maybe more radical stances is what puts people on edge. But it's also when he moves out to the West and, people are looking for jobs, they're looking for opportunities, makes their life quite mobile. And so when he finds this job working in sort of Park City, Utah, not too far from Salt Lake City, his name and reputation has sort of preceded him.
Yeah.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
So do we want to go to that night in Utah and talk about this botched robbery of a grocery store and how Joe Hill ends up becoming a suspect in this?
So there are two storylines that either are related or they aren't. So we know that on January 10th, 1914, John Morrison and his son are killed at this grocery store by two armed intruders, and the intruders are wearing red bandanas that are concealing their faces. That evening, Joe Hill appears on the doorstep of a local doctor. He has a bullet wound in his left lung. Now, these two things could be related. It could be that Hill was part of this burglary and was shot in the process of trying to rob these grocery store owners. But he says that he was shot in an argument over a woman. That when he was shot, his hands were raised. There's some evidence that this was the case based on the exit wound in his back and the exit wound through his coat. Hill did have a pistol, which would not have been at all that unusual, I think, in Utah in 1914. And so those are kind of the facts on the ground when police start investigating this case.
Yeah, but I don't know, it's not clear who's involved. About 12 people get arrested in this as suspects of being sort of tethered to the case. There are people that say that they were eyewitnesses, say that they saw him. Interestingly enough, there is a 13-year-old boy who was the son of one of the victims who was shot and killed. And he immediately sees Joe Hill and is like, no, that's not him. That's definitely not him. And then later, it's not been proved, but he recants his statement and basically says, no, that's him. So I wonder if there were obviously adults that involved, that pressured him to change his statement.
And, of course, Joe Hill himself does have a bullet wound that night. There's this bandana that, belongs to him that maybe shows up, but they don't find the murder weapon. And, his alibi is, I got into a dispute over a woman. But he never identifies who the woman was. He never identifies who the person who shot him was. And so, there's that plain fact, too.
Sounds like a lover's quarrel to me.
Yeah, but, that gets worked by both sides, right? That's like, oh, this is a flimsy alibi. He can't even point out the person who was the people who were involved in the incident where he says he got shot. There's also the romanticized version of that of, Joe Hill kept his honor. He didn't want to name the woman that he was involved with and, yada, yada, yada. So, I think, again, to my eye, like this quickly escapes the facts on the ground and becomes in real time and certainly in the decades and centuries since much more of a sort of myth. But to that end, what ends up happening is Hill is on trial and then he's convicted and he's sitting awaiting execution, and he's sitting in this jail cell in Utah while the country starts to talk about his case and agitation. He is a political prisoner at this moment, and you can imagine becomes a huge rallying cry for the Wobblies in particular, who think that he's been railroaded, and there are appeals to Wilson. There are songs being written about him. There are, people visiting his cell. He is writing letters and missives while he's in the cell, and kind of, I think, in a really interesting way, writing his own mythology in real time. And you look
Helen Keller comes to his aid. I didn't know Helen Keller was a part of the Wobblies. Maybe I forgot that.
Helen Keller was a radical.
Yeah, I knew she was hardcore.
And the Swedish ambassadors get involved, and Woodrow Wilson kind of, tries to not get too dirty here and get too involved. But there are direct appeals to him and other labor leaders. The Wobblies were not, they didn't play nice with a lot of other labor, but, other labor leaders from more kind of, I would say, mainstream organizations and movements kind of come to his defense as well. And it becomes a real rallying cry.
I think what you were saying too, Jody, about Hill being aware of all of this and being aware of the legacy making process. He knows that it is most likely he is going to be executed and is shaping the way he's going to be remembered and what his execution will be used for, which strikes me as, I don't know that I would be able to do that in that sort of situation.
No.
Yeah, and part of it, I think, is just he's one of these people. When words come out of him, they come out in a way that is inspiring and will motivate people. But yeah, that phrase, don't mourn, organize, which it's funny, over the years, people have claimed that was the last thing he said right before he was executed. That's not the case, but he wrote it. He wrote it in a letter. He said it in a conversation kind of right before. But he also wrote this beautiful poem that then got turned into a song called Joe Hill's Last Will. And, that's the kind of stuff that I really glommed onto and was fascinated by, because you see language in that and his other songs that then show up in like Bob Dylan songs 50 years later and in Earl Robeson's songs, and Steve Earle, who I spoke to, and Billy Bragg are kind of picking up little phrases and just that kind of beautiful way that culture works its way through and gets remixed and adapted and so forth.
There's something about, I think, being executed that allows him to have more staying power than if he had just sort of like died in prison. Yeah. Like I think about, I watched this film called Burn, about a slave rebellion, but in it, the guy talks about like what it means to like become a martyr and what it means to have songs, and like the political power is like, oh, better silence than songs, and like they're trying to dispose of him, and he's like, it's better for me basically to die and to become this martyr that can't be killed, this legend, than it is for me to live and then, just be the man and not sort of anything else. There's something very just poetic about that.
Yeah, yeah. The story of his execution itself has all of that poetry and romanticism, if that's the right word. But, they put this paper heart over him. They do the thing where there's like 5, however many it is, people, and only one of them has live ammunition so that then everyone can tell themselves that they weren't the one who actually killed him. They go through the process of saying, ready, aim, and he reportedly just kind of blurts out, fire, go on and fire. Yeah, there's some real sort of beauty and poetry in these last moments. He also has a famous kind of joke where he tells someone like, well, after I'm killed, take my ashes and drive them across take them across the Utah state line. I don't want to be caught dead in Utah, And there's a whole thing actually about Joe Hill's ashes. There's songs called Joe Hill's Ashes, and his ashes, are kind of a really interesting, I would say almost at this point, kind of like secular relic of sorts among progressives. Do you have thoughts on that, Nick?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to describe it. I mean, his ashes are divvied up between something like 700 envelopes, and they're sent all around the world to be released so that his ashes sort of are everywhere. And in a turn of events that I think is so fitting for his life, one of the envelopes is seized by the post office because it had subversive potential, because it had Joe Hill being murdered by, quote unquote, the capitalist class. And this idea that if somebody receives these, then they will attack the United States. And at that time, like the government going through your mail and taking stuff was fairly common. And then ultimately, like, these ashes and the envelope get filed away and ultimately returned to the IWW in 1988.
So one of my favorite stories from the documentary I made and from the research and the reporting I did around this was I was talking with Billy Bragg, the lefty singer, songwriter, one of my favorite artists of all time. And I was chatting with him about Joe Hill, and he told a story about how he was playing a concert, some sort of labor organizing thing or whatever. It was in the maybe late 80s or in the 90s. And someone comes up to him, it may have been Utah Phillips, who comes up to him and says, "Hey, I have some of Joe Hill's ashes on me." And he pulls out an envelope, and there's Joe Hill's ashes.
No.
Reportedly. And Billy Bragg, he tells this story. I'll never forget it. He's like, "What do I do with this? You know, what do I do with this?" And he reaches in, takes a little pinch of ashes, and eats it. No. You know, and he just swallows it. He says, "Now, you know, I'm one with Joe Hill. I'm carrying on his legacy."
Can't co-sign
I
that.
find it very moving. I find it very moving that of all, you know, I think Billy Bragg deserves to eat a little bit of Joe Hill's ashes.
I will say, just to like go in with like the secular relic idea, it has a very Catholic imagery, like in that idea of like, you know, we take in part
the
of
body of Christ. Yeah.
Listen, that's too much. Put it in a little charm, wear it around your neck.
little Angelina Jolie deal.
Something. Wow. That's intense.
It's a lot. Yeah.
So, you know, I think we can wrap it up there. I mean, there was a huge funeral in Chicago, and, you know, and again, you know, I'm really love the sort of tracing the musical legacy here, and that's how he really lives on. And there are still people out there, you know, singing and reworking and adapting his songs. You hear phrases here and there. I mean, the 100th anniversary was, you know, not that long ago, and there was a lot of talk around that. Stephen King named his son Joe Hill, you know, after this. I thought about reaching out to him as a guest for this episode, but, you know, it's still in the air, so to speak. So
quite literally,
anyway.
probably.
Exactly.
I know.
Exactly. But I'm really glad we got to this story. And listeners, if you were to ask me, can I see that documentary? The answer would be, I have no idea where it is. But it's floating around somewhere, but it's probably not very good. But for me,
in the wind.
For me, exactly. For me, it was a great excuse to travel around the country and interview some musicians who I like. And so it was a very fun undergraduate thesis.
That's cool.
But anyway, we did it. I've been waiting all these years to do Joe Hill. And I'm glad.
I hope it was everything you
today.
thought it would be.
It was lovely. All right. Now, as we wrap up the show, let's do this also on this day, some of the other events that happened on this day. And we're going to try something new that we're going to do from time to time this month and next as we're doing the Radiotopia fundraiser. But we have invited some of our fellow Radiotopia show hosts and producers to come on and do also on this day. And so we sent out a list of dates in the Radiotopia Slack, and people responded with their recordings. So here is Ronald Young Jr., who is part of the Radiotopia family with his brilliant show, Wait For It, WEIGHT for it. He also does a bunch of other really incredible work. But anyway, here's Ronald Young Jr. with today's Also On This Day.
This is Ronald Young Jr., host of Wait For It, here with the list of Also On This Day events. So, on this day, November 19th, in 1863, President Lincoln delivers the Gettysburg Address. In 1919, the Senate rejects the Treaty of Versailles. In 1955, National Review publishes its first issue. In 1969, Native American activists seize control of Alcatraz Island. In 1998, the House Judiciary Committee begins impeachment hearings against President Clinton.
All right, that is Ronald Young Jr., the great Ronald Young Jr. recording, and also on this day for us. So thank you for that. And like I said, we're going to have other people from Radiotopia doing that from time to time to remind you of how wonderful the Radiotopia community is. But thank you, Ronald, for doing that.
Yeah, I love to hear Ronald's voice on the podcast.
Thank you, Ron.
And, you know, I suppose we are using this as a gentle reminder that we are part of this wonderful community at Radiotopia that is a bunch of listener-supported shows. We can only do it with your help. So wink, wink, nudge, nudge. It is the Radiotopia fundraiser. If you like this show and you like voices like Ronald and the other voices we'll be featuring over the next month or two, you know what to do, folks. Support Radiotopia.
You have your marching orders.
Exactly. As always, Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
The night before his execution, he passed a small note out through the bars of his prison cell there at the old Sugar House prison. And that was his last will. My will is easy to decide, for there is nothing to divide. My kin don't need to fuss and moan. Moss does not cling to a rolling stone. My body? Ah, if I could choose, I would to ashes it reduce, and let some merry breezes blow them to where some flowers grow. Perhaps some fading flower then would take root and bloom again. This is my last and final will. Good luck to all of you. Joe Hill.
Thanks for listening. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Mardovich, executive producer, Yuri Lasordo, director of operations. Thanks to all of you who support this show by being members of Radiotopia. Find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find us on social, suggest topics, all that and more at our website, thisdaypod.com. See you soon. Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is the only software your business will ever need. Featuring a suite of integrated business applications, Odoo connects your business operations together so you can get more done in less time. Odoo has apps for everything: CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, marketing, manufacturing, you name it, Odoo's got it. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday.
Radiotopia.